On the morning of July 30th, 1973, 29 miners climbed into a double-deck cage at the top of No. 3 shaft at Markham Colliery in Derbyshire, England. 15 men stood on the upper deck, 14 stood on the lower. The shaft was 1,320 feet deep. The cage began its descent at 6:20 in the morning, the start of the day shift. 105 men had already been lowered safely. This was the next load. Halfway down the shaft, the winding engine operator saw sparks erupting from beneath the brake cylinder. He pulled the brake lever to the full on position. Nothing happened. He hit the emergency stop button. Nothing happened. A steel rod inside the brake assembly, a carbon steel component installed in 1952 and never replaced, had fractured into two pieces. The brake shoes were 3 millimeters clear of the brake paths. The cage was in free fall. It accelerated through the remaining 600 feet of shaft and hit the landing bulks at the bottom at 27 miles per hour. The impact was so severe that the lower deck of the cage was crushed into a compressed mass of steel and human bodies. The upper deck survived largely intact, which meant the men on the top could hear the men on the bottom. 60 miners already working underground raced to the shaft bottom and found the cage crumpled against the landing, the gates buckled shut, the men inside screaming to be let out. For 15 minutes, the rescuers tore at the gates with spanners and crowbars in their bare hands. 13 men died at the scene. 5 more died in hospital. 11 survived with injuries so severe that some were unrecognizable. The branch secretary of the Miners' Union, a man named Ike Carter, said the impact must have been terrific, judging by the condition of the bodies. The winding engine that failed had been installed in 1921. The brake system had been modified in 1952. There were 14 separate failsafe devices designed to prevent exactly this kind of accident. Every one of them failed because they all depended on the same brake rod, and the brake rod broke. The mine cage is not a complicated machine. It is an iron box suspended on a steel cable inside a vertical shaft. A winding engine at the surface turns a drum that pays out or reels in the cable, lowering the cage down or raising it up. The cage carries men, equipment, and material between the surface and the working levels of the mine, which in deep mines can be 1,000 feet below ground or more. The deepest mines in the world descend over 2 miles. The cage is the only way in and the only way out. Every miner who works underground steps into that cage at the top of the shaft and trusts the cable will hold. The winding engine will function, the brakes will engage, and the operator who controls the winding drum will stop the cage at the right level, rather than running it into the headgear at the top or slamming it into the sump at the bottom. If any of those things fail, the cage becomes a sealed container in free fall inside a vertical tube of rock. The men inside experience the last seconds of their lives, falling in darkness with no possibility of escape and no way to slow down. The earliest mine hoists used hemp rope wound around a wooden drum turned by a horse walking in a circle. The horse powered the ascent, gravity powered the descent. The only brake was the horse. If the horse stumbled, if the rope frayed, or if the load was too heavy, whatever was on the rope went to the bottom at the speed the shaft allowed. But before there were hoists, there were ladders. In the tin and copper mines of Cornwall, in the coal mines of northern England, and in the silver mines of the Harz Mountains in Germany, miners climbed down into the earth on wooden ladders nailed to the walls of vertical shafts, sometimes descending 1,000 feet or more to reach the working face. The climb down took an hour. The climb back up, after a full shift of hard labor in heat and darkness, took longer, because the men were exhausted, and the rungs were slippery with water that seeped through the rock and ran down the shaft walls in a constant drizzle. Men fell because they were tired, because a rung broke, or because the man above them slipped and knocked them from the ladder. In some mines, the shafts were so deep and the ladder climb so brutal that miners stayed underground for days rather than make the ascent, sleeping in the tunnels between shifts. The ladders killed so many men through falls and exhaustion that the mining engineers of Germany invented the man engine in the early 1800s, a mechanical system of reciprocating platforms driven by a steam engine that carried miners up and down the shaft in 12-foot steps. The miner stood on a small moving platform, rode it up 12 feet, stepped off onto a fixed ledge, waited for the next platform to arrive, and repeated the process until he reached the surface. It was slow, taking 24 minutes to cover what took an hour on ladders, but it was considered safer because a man standing on a platform was less likely to fall than a man climbing a vertical ladder with dead arms and shaking legs at the end of a 10-hour shift. On October 20th, 1919, the man engine at the Levant mine in Cornwall, one of the last still operating in Britain, broke. The machine had been running for over 60 years. A cap on a rod bearing failed, allowing the reciprocating rod to shift laterally. The platforms jammed against the shaft walls. The rod buckled. Men who were standing on the moving platforms when the mechanism failed were thrown from their footholds and fell down the shaft. Men on the fixed ledges were struck by the collapsing rod and its platforms as the entire assembly broke apart. 31 men died. Some fell hundreds of feet. Some were crushed between the rod and the shaft wall. Some were trapped on ledges in the dark with the wreckage of the machine above and below them, unable to climb up or down, and had to be rescued through days of dangerous work in a shaft filled with broken timber and twisted iron. The Levant man engine was scheduled to be replaced by a modern cage and winding engine. The replacement was a year or two from completion. The machine that killed 31 men was already obsolete when it failed. In the 18th century, as mines deepened in the coalfields of England and in the copper and tin mines of Cornwall, steam engines replaced horses. The drums grew larger. The ropes grew longer. Hemp gave way to wire cable after Wilhelm Albert, a German mining engineer, developed the first wire rope for mine hoisting between 1831 and 1834. The shafts went from 100 feet to 500, then 1,000, and then deeper. The first cage, a platform on which men could stand inside the shaft, appeared around 1840. Before that, miners rode the kibble, an open bucket designed to carry ore, sitting on the rim or crouching inside while the bucket swung and spun on the rope in the dark. Kibbles had no guides to keep them tracking straight. They bounced off the shaft walls. They tipped. Men fell out. The cage was an improvement because it ran on guide rails bolted to the shaft walls, keeping it centered and stable. It had sides and a roof that kept the men from being struck by falling rock and water. But the cage introduced a new problem. A kibble carrying 2 men and a load of ore was a small loss if the rope broke. A cage carrying 30 men was a catastrophe. Men who had once climbed ladders down the shaft for an hour to reach their workplace now rode the cage in minutes, packed shoulder to shoulder in an iron box barely large enough to hold them, gripping the walls or the guide rail brackets as the cage dropped into the earth. The descent was fast. In a deep mine, the cage fell at speeds of 20 miles per hour or more, the walls of the shaft blurring past in the light of the headlamp, the air growing warmer and heavier with every 100 feet of depth, the sound changing from the rattle of the winding gear above to the rush of air past the cage and the drip and splash of water streaming down the shaft walls. The men did not speak during the descent. There was nothing to say. Every man in the cage had made this trip before. Every man knew that the cage was an iron box hanging on a cable and that the cable was the only thing between him and the bottom. The cage stopped at the working level with a jolt that bent the men's knees. The gates opened and they filed out into the tunnels. At the end of the shift, they filed back in. The gates closed and the cage ascended. This happened twice a day, every working day, in every shaft mine in the world. The operator's job was to accelerate the cage to speed, maintain that speed through the middle of the shaft, and then brake to a stop at the correct level. He sat in the winding house at the surface, watching an indicator dial that showed the position of the cage in the shaft, his hands on the levers that controlled the engine speed and the brakes. He could not see the shaft. He could not see the cage. He could not hear the men inside it. He controlled their lives by watching a needle move across a dial and pulling a lever at the right moment. The job required absolute concentration, but for the duration of every wind, because the penalty for a lapse was not a mistake that could be corrected. It was a cage full of men hitting the bottom of the shaft or crashing through the headgear at the top. In the early days of steam winding, the operator was often a man pulled from other duties at the mine, not a specialist. He was paid poorly. He worked long hours. He was subject to the same distractions as any other worker: fatigue, hunger, conversation, the need to relieve himself. Every distraction was a potential death sentence for the men in the cage. If the operator misjudged the braking point, if the indicator was faulty, if the engine failed to respond, the cage overshot. If it overshot going up, it crashed through the headgear at the top of the shaft, a disaster called an overwind. If it overshot going down, it hit the bottom at whatever speed it had reached. Either way, the men inside were dead. On April 22, 1872, at the Central Mine in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, 13 Cornish miners climbed into a skip at the top of the shaft. At 10 o'clock at night, during a shift change, the wire rope snapped as they were being lowered. The guides that kept the skip tracking straight in the shaft tore away from the walls. The skip fell freely, smashing through timber supports as it dropped. 8 men were killed instantly. Their bodies were found at the bottom of the shaft, with limbs torn off, faces crushed, bones splintered. The 3 men who survived were trapped in the wreckage of the skip, alive but unable to move, listening to the cries of one man named Joel Bade, who had been impaled on broken timber and was screaming in the darkness. Bade died 12 days later. A poem appeared in the newspapers in Cornwall. Sad news from across the ocean we hear, sad news from the Central Mine. 8 others were killed in that dread place, midst broken timber and stones, with limbs all smashed and disfigured face, torn off flesh and splintered bones. The mine shaft was 660 feet deep. The wire rope that failed was the only thing between 13 men and the bottom. The problem was always the same. The cage was a passive container. It had no propulsion of its own, no braking of its own, no ability to control its own speed. Everything depended on the cable, the engine, and the operator. If any single element in that chain failed, the cage became a falling object subject to the laws of physics and nothing else. A cage in freefall inside a 1,000-foot shaft reaches terminal velocity long before it hits the bottom. The impact is not survivable. The cage deforms around the bodies inside it. The bodies deform against the cage. The forces involved are measured in multiples of gravity so extreme that internal organs separate from the structures that hold them in place. Death in a cage fall is not a single event. It is a sequence. First, the cable parts or the brake fails, and the cage begins to accelerate. The men inside feel the floor drop away beneath their feet. They grab for the walls, the ceiling, or each other. The acceleration continues for seconds that feel much longer than seconds. Then the cage hits the bottom, and the deceleration from falling speed to zero occurs in a distance measured in inches. Everything that was moving inside the cage stops at once. The Vaal Reefs mine in South Africa on May 10, 1995, produced the worst elevator disaster in history. An underground locomotive operating nearly 6,000 feet below the surface entered the wrong tunnel, went out of control, crashed through a safety barrier, and fell into the number 2 shaft. A double-deck cage packed to capacity with over 100 miners was ascending the shaft at that moment. The locomotive fell onto the cage, and the impact severed the detaching hook that connected the cage to the cable. The cage, now disconnected from the winding system, fell 1,500 feet to the bottom of the shaft with every man inside it. 104 miners died. The minister who visited the scene described it as the most gruesome sight he had ever seen. Rescuers who reached the wreckage found bodies crushed so severely that they could only be recovered in parts, brought to the surface on stretchers wrapped in blankets over the following days. The investigation found that the locomotive had been parked in a prohibited area, that an electrical safety circuit had been deliberately bypassed, and that the mine had failed to implement safety measures recommended after a nearly identical incident 3 years earlier. The detaching hook that released the cage was designed to disconnect the cage from the cable in the event of an overwind, to prevent the cage from being pulled into the headgear. In this case, the hook did exactly what it was designed to do, and 104 men died because of it. Had the hook not released, the cable had enough elasticity to absorb the impact. The safety device killed the men it was designed to protect. The solution to cage falls had been known since 1852, when Elisha Otis demonstrated a safety device for elevators at the Crystal Palace exhibition in New York. Otis stood on a platform suspended by a cable above a crowd of spectators and ordered the cable cut. The platform dropped a few inches and stopped, caught by spring-loaded pawls that engaged toothed guide rails on either side of the shaft. Otis had invented the safety catch, the device that made tall buildings possible because it made elevators safe enough for people to ride in them. The mining industry watched. The mining industry did not adopt the technology with anything approaching the speed of the building industry. Safety catches for mine cages existed by the late 1800s, but they were expensive, they required maintenance, they added weight to the cage, and they occasionally engaged when they were not supposed to, stranding the cage in the shaft and stopping production. Production mattered more than safety in mining. It always had. The mines that adopted safety catches did so after disasters, not before them. Mines that did not adopt them continued to lower men on cables, trusting that the cables would hold, that the brakes would work, and that the operator would not be distracted at the wrong moment. A fireman asked about tallow for the engine, and that is exactly what happened at Markham Colliery in 1887. The engine operator was spoken to by a co-worker at the moment the cage reached the top of the shaft. The operator looked away from his indicator. The cage overwound into the headgear, the rope detached, and the cage fell 440 yards. Multiple men died. The coroner's jury recommended safety detaching hooks. The mine installed them. 86 years later, at the same colliery, a brake rod broke and 18 men died in a cage that had 14 failsafe devices and no effective way to stop. 248 miners died at Markham Colliery during its 109 years of operation. That was one mine. Across the British coalfields, across the iron mines of Michigan and Minnesota, across the gold mines of South Africa, and the coal mines of Appalachia. The cage carried men down into the earth and brought them back up again millions of times over 2 centuries of industrial mining. Most of the time it worked. The cable held, the engine ran, the brakes engaged. The operator watched his indicator and stopped the cage at the right level, and the men stepped out and went to work. And then one morning, the cable frayed or the brake rod cracked or the operator looked away or a locomotive fell down the shaft and the cage did what gravity always does when the only thing opposing it fails. It fell. The men inside fell with it in an iron box in the dark. with nothing beneath them but 1,000 feet of air and a floor of rock that was coming up to meet them faster than the human mind can process the information that this is the last thing it will ever know. If this is the kind of history that stays with you, subscribe. There are more machines like this one, and every one of them left a body count the world forgot.